In a world that often feels divided by race, wealth, and age, there are moments that remind us of the surprising connections that can transcend all boundaries. Today, I want to share with you a heartwarming story that does exactly that, a story of kindness, generosity, and an unexpected twist that leaves everyone involved forever changed. It's a story that begins with a simple, everyday encounter between two people who, at first glance, seem to have nothing in common. A black teenager from a struggling neighborhood and a wealthy elderly woman living in a mansion. But sometimes, the most extraordinary things happen in the most ordinary moments. Our story begins on a hot summer day in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone's business. The streets are quiet, the sun is blazing, and people are seeking refuge in the shade or the comfort of their air-conditioned homes. Among them is 17-year-old Jaden, a bright and hard-working young man with big dreams but few resources to pursue them. He spends most of his days helping his family, running errands, and trying to make some extra money through odd jobs in the neighborhood. On this particular afternoon, Jaden finds himself in a part of town he's not usually in, the upscale side, where the homes are grand, the lawns perfectly manicured, and the cars parked in the driveways are worth more than some people's annual salaries. It's a world that feels far removed from Jaden's own life, where every dollar counts and opportunities feel out of reach. As he walks along the tree-lined street, he notices an elderly woman struggling to carry her groceries from her car. The sight tugs at Jaden's heart. Even though he could easily walk past her, pretend he didn't see, something inside him urges him to stop and offer help. After all, his mom always taught him that kindness costs nothing, and it's in these small acts that we can make a big difference. The woman, Mrs. Evelyn Harper, is well known in the community. She's lived in the town for decades, long enough to see it change from a quiet, sleepy place to a thriving suburb. Widowed and living alone in her sprawling mansion, she's an intimidating figure to some, with her stern expression and no-nonsense attitude. But behind the expensive jewelry and tailored clothes, there's a loneliness that few people recognize. Jaden doesn't know this, of course. To him, she's just a frail, elderly woman who could use a hand. "Excuse me, ma'am," he says, approaching her cautiously. "Do you need help with those bags?" Mrs. Harper looks up, surprised by the offer. She's not used to people offering help, especially not teenagers from the other side of town. For a moment she hesitates, unsure whether to accept. But there's something sincere in Jaden's eyes, something that makes her believe he's genuine. "Yes," she replies finally, "that would be very kind of you." As Jaden helps her carry the bags into the house, he's struck by the sheer size and grandeur of the place. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, walls lined with expensive art. It's a far cry from the small, cramped apartment he shares with his family. But Jaden isn't the kind to be envious or bitter. He's always believed that hard work will eventually pay off, even if it takes time. Mrs. Harper watches him quietly as he places the groceries on the kitchen counter, noticing the way he moves with care and respect. There's something different about this young man, she thinks to herself. Unlike others, he isn't in a rush to leave or ask for something in return. He simply helps because it's the right thing to do. "Thank you," she says, her voice softening. "I don't usually get much help around here." Jaden smiles. "No problem, ma'am. Happy to help." As he turns to leave, Mrs. Harper stops him. "Wait," she says, her tone shifting. "What's your name, young man?" "Jaden," he replies, a little puzzled by the question. "Well, Jaden, you've been very kind to me today, and kindness should never go unnoticed." She pauses for a moment, as if deep in thought. "Would you mind coming by tomorrow? I could use some help with a few things around the house, if you're not too busy." Jaden hesitates. He could use the extra money, but he's not sure what to make of this unexpected offer. Mrs. Harper, though intimidating at first, seems genuine in her request. And besides, he has a feeling that this could lead to something more, though he doesn't know what just yet. "Sure," he finally says, "I'll be here." And with that, Jaden leaves, not realizing that this simple decision will change his life forever. What Jaden doesn't know is that Mrs. Harper has been watching him closely, not just today, but for the past few months. She's seen him around town, helping others, always with a smile on his face, never asking for anything in return. She's been looking for someone like him, someone with integrity, a strong work ethic, and a good heart. Because Mrs. Harper has a secret, one that could change everything for Jaden. But she's not ready to reveal it just yet. The next day, when Jaden returns to Mrs. Harper's house, he'll discover that this isn't just about helping with chores. It's about much more than that. Mrs. Harper has a plan, one that involves a life-changing gift, a surprise so unexpected that it will leave Jaden speechless. But what is this gift? And why has Mrs. Harper chosen Jaden of all people? To find out, you'll have to stay tuned for the next part of this incredible story. For now, all we can say is that sometimes, life has a way of rewarding those who do good, even when they least expect it. And for Jaden, this is just the beginning of a journey that will take him places he never imagined. As Jaden walks away from Mrs. Harper's mansion, his mind races with curiosity. Why did she ask him to come back tomorrow? What does she have planned? Little does he know, the answer lies just around the corner, a secret that will turn his life upside down in ways he could never have predicted. Jaden couldn't shake the feeling that something about Mrs. Harper was different. It wasn't just the wealth or the grandeur of her home. There was something in her eyes that hinted at a deeper story, something that made him feel both intrigued and uneasy. As he walked back to his neighborhood that day, thoughts of her lingered in his mind. Why did she want him to come back? What did she see in him? The next morning, Jaden woke up early, unable to sleep well after replaying the events of the previous day. He had agreed to help Mrs. Harper, but he wasn't sure what to expect. It wasn't the first time he had helped someone out, but there was something about the way she'd looked at him that made him feel like this was more than just a one-off favor. Maybe she was just lonely, he thought. After all, living in a huge house like that by yourself had to be isolating. But as much as he tried to rationalize it, a part of him couldn't ignore the feeling that something bigger was at play. Before heading over to her house, Jaden checked in with his mom. She was working her usual morning shift at the diner, and although they didn't have much time to talk, she had a way of giving Jaden advice with just a few words. "You're a good boy, Jaden," she said while packing his lunch for the day. "Never stop helping people, no matter where you come from or where you end up. You never know when kindness will come back to you." Her words echoed in his mind as he made his way to Mrs. Harper's house. It was something she had said to him all his life. Despite their struggles, his mother had always found a way to help others, and she had raised Jaden to do the same. He didn't know if this time it would come back to him, but he couldn't help but feel that his mother's wisdom was especially important today. When he arrived at the mansion, Mrs. Harper was waiting for him at the door, a slight smile on her face. Her demeanor was softer than the day before, as if his simple act of kindness had begun to break down the walls she had built around herself. "Good morning, Jaden," she greeted him. "I hope I didn't trouble you too much by asking you to come back." "Not at all, ma'am," Jaden replied, feeling a little nervous, but masking it with a polite smile. "I'm happy to help." As he stepped inside the house, he couldn't help but be overwhelmed by the lavishness of it all. Every inch of the place seemed to be filled with expensive furniture, artwork, and family heirlooms. The contrast between his small, modest home and this opulence was stark. But what caught his attention the most was a large painting hanging above the fireplace. It was a portrait of a man, tall, distinguished with sharp features and a commanding presence. There was something familiar about him, though Jaden couldn't quite place it. Noticing his gaze, Mrs. Harper spoke up. "That's my late husband, Robert. He passed away many years ago. He was a businessman, very successful in his time." Jaden nodded, unsure of how to respond. The sadness in her voice was palpable, but it was clear she didn't want to dwell on it. "I appreciate you helping me today, Jaden," she continued, her tone shifting. "I've been meaning to get some things in order around the house, but I haven't been able to do it alone. If you're up for it, I'd like to have you help me with a few more tasks." Jaden agreed, though he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Mrs. Harper's request. As they worked through the day, he helped her clean out the attic, move furniture, and organize old boxes of belongings. Each task gave Jaden a glimpse into Mrs. Harper's life, her past, her memories, and the people she had lost. In the attic, Jaden stumbled upon an old chest covered in dust. Mrs. Harper, who had been overseeing his work, suddenly became quiet when she saw it. "That chest," she said softly. "I haven't opened it in years." Jaden looked at her, sensing the weight of whatever was inside. "Do you want me to open it?" For a long moment, Mrs. Harper was silent, as if she were deciding whether she was ready to confront the memories locked away in that chest. Finally, she nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's see what's inside." Jaden carefully unlatched the chest and opened it, revealing an assortment of old photographs, letters, and what appeared to be a set of documents. Mrs. Harper knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she sifted through the contents. The photographs were of her and her husband in their younger days, traveling the world and attending lavish parties. But there were also pictures of people Jaden didn't recognize, family members, friends, and even a few of what looked like business partners. Mrs. Harper's eyes lingered on one photograph in particular, a black and white image of a young man standing next to Robert Harper. The man was dressed in a sharp suit, his face serious, but there was a look of determination in his eyes. Jayden couldn't help but notice that the man bore a striking resemblance to Mrs. Harper. "Who's this?" he asked, pointing to the photo. Mrs. Harper's expression darkened, and for the first time, Jayden saw a flash of something anger, maybe even regret cross her face. "That's my son," she said, her voice tight. "Or at least he was." Jayden looked at her, confused. "Was?" Mrs. Harper sighed heavily, as if the weight of the past was too much to bear. "We haven't spoken in years. He made choices that I couldn't accept, choices that drove a wedge between us." Jayden didn't press her for more details, but the pain in her voice was clear. Whatever had happened between her and her son had left a deep wound, one that time hadn't healed. After a few moments of silence, Mrs. Harper stood up and closed the chest, as if shutting away the memories once again. "Thank you for your help, Jayden," she said, her voice more composed now. "That will be all for today." Jayden nodded and began to gather his things, but before he could leave, Mrs. Harper stopped him. "Jayden," she said, her tone softer than before, "I want you to know something. I've been watching you for a while now. You remind me of someone I once knew, someone who had the same kindness in their heart, the same drive to do good in the world." Jayden wasn't sure what to say. He had no idea what Mrs. Harper was talking about, but her words struck a chord with him. "I don't know what your plans are for the future," she continued, "but I see potential in you. You have something special, something that not many people have, and I'd like to help you reach that potential, if you'll let me." Jayden was taken aback. He had come here, expecting to help Mrs. Harper with a few chores, but now she was talking about helping him. It didn't make sense. "What do you mean?" he asked, genuinely curious. Mrs. Harper smiled, though it was a sad smile. "All in due time, Jayden. All in due time. For now, just know that I believe in you, and when the time is right, I'll show you what I mean." With that, she ushered him out of the house, leaving Jayden with more questions than answers. As Jayden walked home that day, his mind raced with everything that had happened. What was Mrs. Harper talking about? Why did she seem so interested in him? And what was the story behind her estranged son? The more he thought about it, the more confused he became. Over the next few weeks, Jayden continued to help Mrs. Harper around the house. Each day, she would give him small tasks, organizing rooms, cleaning out old belongings, even helping her with errands. But despite the growing familiarity between them, Mrs. Harper remained tight-lipped about the deeper mysteries of her life. She never spoke of her son again, and she never elaborated on the potential she saw in Jayden. But there were moments, fleeting but unmistakable, when Jayden could see the wheels turning in her mind. It was as if she was waiting for something, waiting for the right moment to reveal whatever secret she was keeping. And then, one day, it happened. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Jayden had just finished helping Mrs. Harper organize some old paperwork in her study. As he was getting ready to leave, Mrs. Harper called him back into the room. "Jayden," she said, her tone serious. "There's something I need to show you." Jayden's heart raced. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. Whatever Mrs. Harper had been hiding, she was finally ready to reveal it. But what she showed him was beyond anything he could have imagined. Mrs. Harper led him to a hidden door at the back of the study, one that Jayden had never noticed before. Behind it was a small, dimly lit room filled with old files, boxes, and what looked like legal documents. In the center of the room was a large safe. With trembling hands, Mrs. Harper unlocked the safe and pulled out a thick envelope. "This," she said, handing it to Jayden, "is the key to everything." Jayden opened the envelope, his hands shaking. Inside were documents, legal papers, photographs, letters, each one more shocking than the last. And as he read through them, the truth began to unfold. Mrs. Harper's son hadn't just made bad choices. He had been involved in something far more dangerous, something that had torn the family apart and left Mrs. Harper living in fear. The documents revealed a web of deceit, corruption, and betrayal that stretched back years. And now, Jayden was caught in the middle of it. As he looked up at Mrs. Harper, her face pale and haunted, he realized that whatever had happened in the past was far from over. The mystery wasn't just about Mrs. Harper's estranged son. It was about something much bigger. And Jayden was about to become a part of it. The next few days were a blur for Jayden. Every time he thought he had a handle on what was happening, a new piece of information would surface, throwing him deeper into the mystery. Mrs. Harper's son, it seemed, had been involved in a series of illegal dealings, some of which had ties to powerful figures in the city. These dealings had led to his downfall and the estrangement from his mother. But that wasn't the end of the story. As Jaden dug deeper into the documents Mrs. Harper had given him, he uncovered something even more shocking: a series of payments made to individuals who were now either missing or dead. The names on the documents were unfamiliar to Jaden, but he could see that Mrs. Harper's son had been at the center of a dangerous conspiracy, and now those same forces were closing in. Jaden could feel the pressure building. He had to find out the truth, not just for Mrs. Harper, but for himself. The more he learned, the more he realized that this wasn't just about a family feud, it was about power, money, and control. And the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. As the tension mounted, Jaden knew that he was running out of time. The people behind the conspiracy were ruthless, and they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who got in their way, including him. But Jaden wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. He had come too far to turn back now. The mystery was unraveling, and with each new revelation, the danger grew. But Jaden was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The weight of the revelations hung heavily in the air. Jaden's mind was racing, his thoughts tumbling over one another as he tried to process the tangled web of corruption, betrayal, and danger that now surrounded him. He had started out doing a good deed, helping an elderly woman in need. And now he was caught up in something far beyond anything he could have imagined. But there was no turning back. Not now. Not when he was so deep into it. Over the next few days, Jaden continued to work for Mrs. Harper, though their conversations became increasingly tense. The more he learned, the more questions arose, and Mrs. Harper, for her part, became more withdrawn and secretive. She had given Jaden a glimpse into her past, into the dark and dangerous life her son had led, but she was holding something back. Jaden could sense it. There was more to the story, something she hadn't told him yet. It was during one of these quiet, uneasy afternoons, while they were sorting through old financial documents, that Jaden finally decided to confront her. "Mrs. Harper," he began carefully, watching her face for any sign of reaction. "There's something I don't understand." Mrs. Harper didn't look up from the papers in front of her, but Jaden saw her hand stiffen slightly. "What is it, Jaden?" she asked, her voice calm but guarded. These payments, he gestured to the files they had been reviewing for days, filled with suspicious transactions and unexplained sums of money. "They don't make sense. The amounts, the timing. It's all too deliberate." Mrs. Harper said nothing, her silence speaking volumes. "And your son," Jaden continued, pushing forward. "He was involved in something, wasn't he? Something dangerous. But there's more to it than what you've told me. I need to know the truth, Mrs. Harper. If I'm going to help you, I need to know what I'm up against." For a long moment, Mrs. Harper was silent, her eyes focused on the papers in front of her, as if she were weighing her options, deciding how much to reveal. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "There are things, Jaden," she said slowly, "that are better left buried." Jaden leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "I don't think that's true. Not anymore." Mrs. Harper sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of years of secrets. "You're right," she said finally. "There is more to the story. Much more. But if I tell you, Jaden, you have to understand, this isn't just about my son anymore. This is about people who will stop at nothing to protect their interests. People who are far more dangerous than you realize." Jaden felt a chill run down his spine. He had known, of course, that the situation was dangerous. But hearing Mrs. Harper say it out loud, hearing the fear in her voice, made it all the more real. "I'm not afraid," he said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his nerves. Mrs. Harper looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and resignation. "You should be," she said quietly, "because once you know the truth, there's no going back." With that, she stood up and walked across the room to a large, ornate cabinet that Jaden hadn't noticed before. She opened it, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a stack of files, thicker and more worn than the ones they had been sorting through. These were older, more personal. Mrs. Harper hesitated for a moment, then pulled them out and handed them to Jaden. "These," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "are the real records. The ones I've kept hidden all these years." Jaden took the files, his hands shaking. He opened them slowly, his eyes scanning the contents. And that's when he saw it. The name. A name he recognized. A name that sent shockwaves through his entire body. It was his father's name. For a moment, Jaden couldn't breathe. He stared at the page, his mind reeling, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. His father's name clear as day, written in bold letters across a series of transactions, payments, and business dealings that dated back nearly 2 decades. He looked up at Mrs. Harper, his face pale, his voice barely a whisper. "What is this?" Mrs. Harper closed her eyes, her face contorted in pain. "I'm so sorry, Jaden," she said softly. "I never wanted you to find out this way." Jaden shook his head, unable to comprehend what he was reading. "My dad, he was involved in this? In everything your son was a part of?" Mrs. Harper nodded, her eyes filled with regret. "Yes, Jaden, your father and my son. They were business partners. In the beginning, it was legitimate real estate investments. But somewhere along the way, things changed. They got involved with the wrong people, made deals they shouldn't have made. And when it all fell apart, your father tried to walk away." Jaden's heart was racing, his mind spinning with questions. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice rising. "What happened to my dad?" Mrs. Harper took a deep breath, steadying herself. "He disappeared," she said quietly. "One day, he just vanished. No one ever saw him again." Jaden felt like the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. His father had been missing for years, vanished without a trace, when Jaden was just a boy. His mother had always told him that his father had left them, that he had run off and abandoned their family. But now, hearing Mrs. Harper's story, Jaden realized that wasn't the whole truth. There was more. So much more. Jaden's mind raced back to the last time he had seen his father. He had been young, no more than 8 or 9 years old, but he remembered that day clearly. His father had come home late, disheveled, nervous, not himself. He had kissed Jaden goodnight, told him he loved him, and then he was gone. For years, Jaden had carried the pain of that abandonment, the anger and resentment that came with it. But now, the anger was replaced by something else. Fear. "What are you saying?" Jaden asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That my dad didn't leave us? That he was killed?" Mrs. Harper's face was etched with sorrow. "I don't know, Jaden. I wish I had the answers. All I know is that your father got in too deep, and when he tried to get out, things went bad. My son told me that your father was trying to do the right thing. But the people they were working with, they didn't take kindly to betrayal." Jaden's chest tightened as the enormity of the situation hit him. His father hadn't abandoned him. He had been caught up in something far more dangerous than Jaden had ever realized. And now, Jaden was standing in the middle of it. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Jaden demanded, his voice shaking. "Why did you wait until now?" Mrs. Harper looked down, guilt clouding her eyes. "Because I thought I could protect you," she said softly. "I thought if I kept the truth from you, you wouldn't have to carry the same burden your father did. But I was wrong, Jaden. I see that now. You deserve to know the truth." Jaden's mind raced. The truth. The truth was that his father had been involved in something dangerous, something that had cost him his life. And now, that same danger was closing in on Jaden. But he couldn't walk away. Not now. "Who are these people?" Jaden asked, his voice hardening. "The ones who did this to my dad?" Mrs. Harper hesitated, her face pale. "I don't know all of them," she said. "But I do know one name. He's the man who brought your father and my son into the business. The one who made everything happen." Jaden leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Who?" Mrs. Harper's voice was barely a whisper. "His name is Donovan Black." Jaden froze. The name sent a chill down his spine. Donovan Black. The man his father had worked for. The man who had orchestrated everything. And the man who, according to the documents in front of him, was still very much alive. The revelation hit Jaden like a freight train. Donovan Black wasn't just some shadowy figure from the past. He was still out there, still pulling the strings, still controlling the empire that had destroyed Jaden's family. And now, Jaden was a part of it. As he sat in Mrs. Harper's study, the weight of the situation pressing down on him, he realized that he had a choice to make. He could walk away, leave the past behind, forget about his father's involvement, and try to move on with his life. Or, he could confront the truth head on. Jaden knew that the second option was dangerous. If Donovan Black was still out there, still controlling the criminal enterprise that had cost Jaden's father his life, then going after him would be like stepping into the lion's den. But Jaden couldn't ignore the fire burning inside him, the need for answers, for justice, for closure. He had spent his entire life wondering why his father had left, why he had never come back. Now he knew the truth. His father hadn't abandoned him. He had been taken from him. And Jaden wasn't about to let that go. The next few days were a blur of research, phone calls, and dead ends. Jaden scoured the city for any information he could find about Donovan Black, but the man was a ghost. There were no recent photos, no public records, nothing that suggested he even existed. But Jaden knew better. Donovan Black was out there, lurking in the shadows, controlling everything from behind the scenes. It was late one night, after hours of fruitless searching, that Jaden's phone rang. He answered it without thinking, his mind still focused on the files spread out in front of him. "Hello?" A deep, gravelly voice came through the line, sending a chill down Jaden's spine. "You're getting too close, kid." Jaden's heart stopped. He gripped the phone tighter, his breath catching in his throat. "Who is this?" The voice chuckled, low and menacing. "You know who I am." Jaden's mind raced. Donovan Black. It had to be him. The voice on the other end of the phone echoed in Jaden's mind, long after the call had ended. "You're getting too close, kid." The warning had been clear, but Jaden wasn't the type to back down, especially not now. With every passing day, his desire to uncover the truth grew stronger, the weight of his father's memory pressing on him like a constant reminder of the unfinished business hanging over his life. But what had truly unnerved Jaden wasn't the threat itself, it was the voice. The voice was different from what he had imagined for Donovan Black. It wasn't the refined, cunning tone of a seasoned criminal mastermind. It had been rough, almost tired, as if whoever had called him was carrying a burden just as heavy as Jaden's. It made him wonder, who was Donovan Black really? Was he the powerful man behind the scenes Mrs. Harper had warned him about, or was there more to the story than even she knew? Jaden's mind swirled with questions as he lay awake in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, sleep eluding him once again. He had opened Pandora's box, and now the pieces of the past were flooding in. But where could he go from here? He had no solid leads, only fragments of information from Mrs. Harper and the files she had shown him. Every attempt to dig deeper into Donovan Black had turned up nothing. It was as if the man had wiped himself clean from the face of the earth. And yet, the phone call proved he was very much alive and watching Jaden closely. With no other choice, Jaden knew he had to go back to the one place he dreaded, the place where it had all started. It had been years since Jaden had visited the dilapidated old neighborhood where his father had last lived, a crumbling part of town that had long since been forgotten by the city. He had spent a good portion of his childhood there, back when things were simpler, before everything had gone wrong. Now, as he drove through the narrow streets, memories of his father surfaced, but they weren't happy ones. They were filled with tension, whispered arguments late at night between his parents, and the slow unraveling of the family he had once known. The house, or what remained of it, stood at the corner of an overgrown lot, its paint peeling and windows boarded up. Jaden parked his car across the street and stared at the wreckage of his past. The house had been abandoned for years, left to rot, just like the memories it held. But Jaden wasn't here for nostalgia. He was here for answers. Stepping out of the car, Jaden crossed the street, his heart pounding in his chest. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of traffic from a nearby highway. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but something told him that if Donovan Black had any lingering connection to his father, it would be here, buried among the ruins. Jaden hesitated at the front door. It hung ajar, the wood warped from years of neglect. Taking a deep breath, he pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell of mildew and decay assaulted him immediately, but he pressed on, navigating through the debris that littered the floor. Dust clung to every surface, and the once familiar rooms were now unrecognizable in their state of disrepair. As he moved deeper into the house, a strange sense of déjà vu washed over him, as if the walls themselves were trying to tell him something he had long forgotten. He made his way to his father's old study, the one place in the house that had always been off limits when he was a child. It was here, his mother had once told him, that his father had conducted his business, the kind of business that, in hindsight, Jaden now realized had been anything but legitimate. The study was just as he had expected, covered in dust, the furniture overturned, and papers scattered across the floor. It was clear that someone had been here before him, searching for something. Jaden sifted through the mess, picking up old notebooks, ledgers, and letters, but most of it was mundane bills, personal correspondence, nothing out of the ordinary. Just as Jaden was about to give up, his hand brushed against something heavy beneath the desk. He crouched down and found a small, metal lockbox hidden in the shadows. It was rusty, the lock long broken, and with a little effort, he pried it open. Inside was a collection of documents, yellowed with age, and a few scattered photographs. Jaden's breath caught in his throat as he flipped through the papers. Some were old business contracts, others were personal letters, but it was the photographs that drew his attention. One in particular stood out, a picture of his father, standing with a man Jayden didn't recognize. The man had a hard face, his expression cold and calculating, but there was something familiar about him. As Jayden studied the photo, a memory surfaced, faint but undeniable. He had seen this man before. Not in person, but in one of the many documents Mrs. Harper had shown him. His name had come up several times, listed alongside Donovan Black's as a key player in their business dealings. Jayden's heart raced. This man, whoever he was connected to his father and to Donovan Black. Before Jayden could process what he had found, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. Someone was in the house. Slowly, Jayden rose to his feet, the photograph still clutched in his hand. He backed away from the desk, his eyes scanning the room for a way out. The footsteps were getting closer, deliberate and heavy, and Jayden knew whoever was coming wasn't here by accident. Without thinking, he slipped the photograph into his pocket and ducked behind a large, overturned bookcase, just as the door to the study creaked open. Through the narrow gap between the bookcase and the wall, Jayden watched as a figure entered the room. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in dark clothing. His face was obscured by the shadowy light filtering through the dirty windows, but there was no mistaking the predatory way he moved, as if he was searching for something or someone. Jayden held his breath, his heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't make out the man's face, but something about his presence felt familiar. Had he been the one to call Jayden that night? Was he working for Donovan Black? The man prowled around the study, his eyes scanning the room with an intensity that made Jayden's skin crawl. He moved with the precision of someone who had done this many times before, someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. After what felt like an eternity, the man finally left, disappearing back into the hallway. Jayden waited, listening for any sign that the intruder was gone, but the house was silent once more. When he was sure it was safe, Jayden emerged from his hiding place, his mind racing. Who was that man, and what was he doing here? More importantly, how had he known to come now, just as Jayden was getting closer to the truth? Shaken but determined, Jayden left the house, the photograph burning a hole in his pocket. He needed answers, and there was only one person who might have them. Mrs. Harper was waiting for him when he arrived at her home later that evening. She opened the door with a tired expression, as if she had been expecting him. "Jayden," she said softly, her voice laced with concern. "What's going on? You look troubled." Jayden didn't waste any time. He pulled the photograph from his pocket and held it out to her. "Who is this man?" Mrs. Harper's eyes widened as she took the photo from him, her hands trembling slightly. She stared at it for a long moment, her face draining of color. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In my father's old house," Jayden replied. "It was hidden in a lockbox. I think this man, whoever he is, was involved in whatever happened to my dad." "Do you know him?" Mrs. Harper hesitated, her gaze flicking between the photograph and Jayden. "Yes," she said finally, her voice heavy with dread. "I know him. His name is Vincent Kane. He was Donovan Black's right-hand man." Jayden felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Vincent Kane. The name sent a chill down his spine. He had heard it before, mentioned in passing during his research into Donovan Black's empire. Kane was known to be ruthless, a man who handled the dirty work that Donovan Black himself never wanted to touch. "Why was my dad involved with him?" Jayden asked, his voice hardening. "What did Kane have to do with my father's disappearance?" Mrs. Harper closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging, as if the weight of the past was too much to bear. "Your father, he tried to get out, Jayden. He wanted to leave the business, but Donovan and Vincent wouldn't let him. They made it clear that anyone who tried to walk away from their operation didn't live long enough to tell the tale." Jayden's blood ran cold. The pieces were finally starting to fall into place. His father hadn't just been involved with Donovan Black, he had tried to escape from him, and Vincent Kane had been sent to make sure that didn't happen. "What happened to him?" Jayden demanded, his voice shaking with anger. "Did Kane kill him?" Mrs. Harper shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know for sure, Jayden. But I do know that after your father disappeared, Kane took over his role in the organization. Whatever your father was involved in, Kane was there to clean up the mess." Jayden clenched his fists, the anger building inside him like a storm. His father had been taken from him because of Donovan Black, because of Vincent Kane. And now, Jayden was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. But as he stood there, staring at the photograph of his father with Vincent Kane, he realized something else. This wasn't just about his father anymore. It was about him too. Donovan Black had warned him that he was getting too close. Kane had shown up at his father's house, searching for something, perhaps the very same photograph Jaden now held in his hands. Jaden was in over his head, and he knew it. But he couldn't stop now, not when he was so close to the truth. The next few days were a blur of planning, strategizing, and sleepless nights. Jaden knew he was playing a dangerous game, but the stakes were too high to walk away. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was connected: his father's disappearance, Donovan Black's empire, and now, Vincent Kane's sudden reappearance. But the more Jaden dug into Vincent Kane's past, the more elusive the man became. Kane had always operated in the shadows, a ghost in the criminal underworld. There were whispers about his involvement in high-profile disappearances, extortion, and even murder, but nothing concrete. He had covered his tracks well, leaving no trace of his true identity or whereabouts. Jaden's only lead was the photograph, the one piece of evidence that linked his father to Kane and, by extension, to Donovan Black. But even that wasn't enough to bring Kane out into the open. Frustration gnawed at Jaden, but he refused to give up. He spent hours poring over old news articles, legal documents, and financial records, searching for any connection between Kane, Black, and his father. And then, one night, he found it. It was buried deep within an old court case from nearly 2 decades ago, a legal dispute over a piece of property that Donovan Black had acquired under suspicious circumstances. The case had been dismissed, of course, but one name stood out in the paperwork: Vincent Kane, listed as Black's business associate and legal advisor. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The property in question was the same house Jaden had just visited, his father's old home. Jaden's mind raced as he pieced together the puzzle. The house hadn't just been his family's home, it had been the center of whatever deal Donovan Black and Vincent Kane were involved in. And his father had been caught in the middle. Suddenly, everything made sense. The house wasn't just a relic of Jaden's past, it was the key to unlocking the truth about his father's disappearance. But as Jaden sat there, staring at the court documents, a new thought crept into his mind. If Kane and Black were willing to kill his father over this property, what were they willing to do to keep Jaden from uncovering the truth? The answer came in the form of a text message sent to Jaden's phone just as he was about to leave his apartment. It was from an unknown number, but the message was clear. "Stop digging, or you'll end up like your father." Jaden's blood ran cold. The threat was unmistakable, but this time, he wasn't backing down. With the photograph of his father and Vincent Kane in hand, Jaden knew what he had to do. He was going to confront Donovan Black. And this time, he wasn't leaving without answers. The confrontation with Donovan Black didn't go as Jaden had planned. He had spent days preparing for the meeting, gathering every piece of evidence he could find, rehearsing the questions he needed to ask. But when he finally stood face to face with the man who had haunted his every waking moment, he realized just how outmatched he was. Black was calm, composed, and utterly in control. He didn't deny any of Jaden's accusations. In fact, he barely seemed surprised by them. "Your father was a good man," Black said, his voice low and steady. "But he made some bad choices. Choices that put him and you in danger." Jaden's anger flared. "You're the one who put him in danger. You and Kane." Black's expression didn't change. "Your father knew the risks when he got involved with us. He tried to walk away, but there are some things you can't walk away from." Jaden clenched his fists, his heart pounding in his chest. "And what about Kane? He was the one who killed my father, wasn't he?" Black's eyes darkened. "Vincent Kane does what he's told. Nothing more, nothing less." The implication was clear. Donovan Black had ordered the hit on Jaden's father. But before Jaden could press him further, Black leaned forward, his gaze locking onto Jaden's. "You need to stop, Jaden," he said softly, "before you get yourself killed." Jaden felt a chill run down his spine. Black wasn't threatening him, he was warning him. But why? Why would a man like Donovan Black care whether Jaden lived or died? The answer came in Black's next words. "Your father wasn't the only one who made bad choices," Black said. "You're making them too." Jaden's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Black's gaze didn't waver. "You've been digging too deep, asking too many questions. You've attracted attention, dangerous attention." Jaden's mind raced. Who else could be involved in this twisted web of secrets and lies? But before he could say anything, Black stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "Go home, Jaden," he said quietly, "and stop looking for answers. Some truths are better left buried." Jaden left the meeting feeling more confused and conflicted than ever. He had come for answers, but all he had gotten were more questions. And the worst part? He couldn't shake the feeling that Donovan Black was right. The tension hung over Jaden like a dark cloud as he drove back home. His mind raced with everything that had happened: Mrs. Harper's warnings, the mysterious intruder at his father's house, the confrontation with Donovan Black, and now the threat that loomed over him like a ticking time bomb. Who were these dangerous people Black had warned him about? What kind of attention had Jaden attracted by simply trying to uncover the truth about his father? He didn't have time to find out. As Jaden turned down his street, a black SUV appeared in his rearview mirror, following him closely. At first, he thought it was just a coincidence, another car heading in the same direction. But when the SUV sped up, closing the distance between them, Jaden's heart sank. It wasn't a coincidence. They were coming for him. As Jaden glanced back at the black SUV speeding up behind him, panic surged through his veins. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as his heart pounded in his chest. He had expected, threats had even braced for danger, but the reality of it now bore down on him with terrifying clarity. Whoever was in that SUV wasn't just trying to intimidate him, they were coming to eliminate him. Jaden's mind raced. He couldn't lead them back to his apartment. That would be a death sentence. His thoughts flashed to the dark alleyways he knew of nearby, areas where he might be able to shake them. He swerved sharply into the next side street, tires screeching on the asphalt, hoping to lose them in the narrow corridors of the city. But the SUV stayed close, relentless. As Jaden sped through the streets, weaving between cars and blowing through red lights, his phone buzzed on the passenger seat. His mind screamed at him to ignore it, but something told him it could be important, another piece of the puzzle, another clue to the mystery he was now entrenched in. Glancing at the phone, he saw an unknown number lighting up the screen. With one hand gripping the wheel and his heart pounding, he tapped to answer. A cold, familiar voice echoed through the line. "You should have listened, Jaden." It was Donovan Black. Jaden's pulse quickened, fury bubbling beneath his skin. "Black, what the hell is going on? Who's after me?"